Thank you very much. A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the three key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Not happy about that. You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
Two dramatic moments, just 4 days apart. In one, Donald Trump is at war. In another, he is angry at not having peace. So what happened? Well, 12 days ago, Israel launched a surprise all-out war against Iran, partly to derail nuclear peace talks with the United States. Iran responded, firing hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles at Israeli cities. Israel then called on the US to join its fight to take out Iran's nuclear facilities. On Saturday, Trump did just that, sending in his powerful B-2 bombers and destroying 3 facilities. Then last night, Iran fired airstrikes at a US military base in Qatar, one of its allies in the region. Just hours after that, Trump announced a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. If your head is hurting trying to keep up, you're not alone. So what exactly happened, and what happens next? Earlier, I spoke to Fawaz Gergis, Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics. He's the author of The Great Betrayal, The Struggle for Freedom and Democracy in the Middle East. Just thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Now, help us make sense of the last 24 hours. We were just coming off U.S. airstrikes on 3 nuclear facilities in Iran. It felt like it was going to be an escalation. We saw a retaliatory strike from Iran on Qatar, of all countries, an ally of Iran in the region. That was followed shortly by an announcement that everything was coming to a halt, that the war was over, and there was a ceasefire. How does this make sense?
I think there is not much clarity at this particular point because the dust has not settled on the battlefield. We are blinded by the dust. But here are my 3 3 points. The first point is that the Iranian leadership does not really want to be dragged into all-out war with the United States. Iran has been working hard in the past decade not to really get dragged into war with the United States because Iran knew very well that Benjamin Netanyahu has been trying very hard to get the United States to attack Iran. So what we have seen in the past 24 hours is that the American retaliation was very limited. It was very limited to one American military base in Qatar, Al Udeid. And the Iranian leadership had informed the Qatari leadership of the coming attack. So really, in a way, this was Iran's statement to the United States that, look, we do not really want all-out war with you. We want just to retaliate and assert our independence as sovereignty. No Americans were injured, and I think the American leadership got the message. This is point 1. Point 2 is that what we have learned in the past 24 hours is that Donald Trump, even though he attacked Iran, and even though that Benjamin Netanyahu basically convinced Donald Trump to attack Iran, the United States does not really want a regime change in Tehran. Donald Trump does not really want to take the United States into another catastrophic military blunder or adventure in the Middle East. And he made it very clear this morning that he does not really want regime change in Tehran, even though he would like to, ideally, in an ideal world. Point 3, one of the points that we have learned, and it's not surprising, that only Donald Trump can stop Benjamin Netanyahu. Only Donald Trump can exert pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to end his wars, not just against Iran, but even in Gaza if he wants to. And we saw today how Donald Trump stood Benjamin Netanyahu down, how he swore at Benjamin Netanyahu and at Israel, even though he included Iran. But this tells me all along that Israel could not have declared all-out war against Iran without a green light from the United States. This was a coordinated Israel's attack or attacks on Iran with the blessing of the United States. So we have some clarity about some points, but we have to wait and see what will happen the morning after. And the morning after, there are more questions than answers about what will happen between Iran and the United States and between Iran and Israel in the next few days and next few months.
And I think that's an important point you raised about whether Israel or the United States was really leading the way over the last 12 days. There was so much reporting that came out over what was happening inside the White House in the lead up to Iran's surprise attack on surprise attack on Iran's military and its military commanders that we saw happen that kick-started this entire war. And there were questions around whether Netanyahu had led the U.S. Into a war that it did not want to start and that Trump was essentially following. And then we saw, as you mentioned this morning, a furious response from Donald Trump castigating Israel for breaking a ceasefire that he had negotiated. Do you think Netanyahu overplayed his hand here, or did he get exactly what he wanted?
My take on it is that the biggest winner, if you tell me who is the biggest winner of this war of choice, this illegal and unjust war, it's Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu spent his lifetime trying to basically get the United States, to drag the United States, to entrap the United States in a war against Iran. He has been working on this since the 1990s. Benjamin Netanyahu is a card-carrying honorary member of the neoconservative movement, which really has visceral hatred towards Iraq, which led to the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003, and also against Iran itself. So Benjamin Netanyahu failed till now. He failed to convince President George W. Bush to expand his war against Iran. He failed to convince President Barack Obama. If you read the memoirs of Barack Obama and his senior advisors, in 2014, 2015, Barack Obama and his senior advisors were very much concerned that Benjamin Netanyahu was going to attack Iran before the signing of the 2015 nuclear deal with the United States and the great powers. And Barack Obama said he had to intervene directly in order to dissuade Benjamin Netanyahu from sabotaging the signing of the 2015 nuclear deal. And we know now very well that Benjamin Netanyahu tried very hard to get Joe Biden to expand the war into Iran, even though Benjamin Netanyahu outsmarted, outmaneuvered, outplayed Joe Biden on Gaza. Joe Biden had a red line, and the red line was no war against Iran. So in this particular sense, in fact, the reason why I say that Benjamin Netanyahu is the clear winner, because he entrapped Donald Trump. He entrapped Donald Trump and got him to attack Iran. Even though probably he's unhappy now, Benjamin Netanyahu, because he was hoping to entrap Donald Trump in all-out war against Iran, because his overarching strategic aim is to what? Is to bring about regime change in Iran. And the reason why basically Donald Trump stepped back from the brink, not because of the global outcry, but because there was a great deal of pushback within the power base, the supporters within the MAGA movement, the Republican movement. the ones who basically elected Donald Trump, who do not really believe in military engagement. And the irony is that Donald Trump was elected on a platform of a peace president. He himself spent his lifetime attacking American leaders for engaging, entrapping, embroiling the United States in forever wars, in particular in the Middle East. So the fact is that Benjamin Netanyahu convinced Donald Trump, despite everything that we know about Donald Trump and his coalition, his electoral coalition, is a testament to the ability of Netanyahu to outplay, outsmart, outmaneuver Donald Trump. And historians will look at this particular point and say, I mean, here is a very clever and corrupt and criminal politician, Benjamin Netanyahu, outsmarting and entrapping a naive president who does not really know anything about world affairs except anecdotes and cliché.
And a big part of this, too, was Netanyahu's attempt at derailing nuclear peace talks that Donald Trump himself seemed very invested in getting across the line. This was something that he spoke about a lot. He praised the process. He really believed that, at least that's what he was signaling in public, that the U.S. and Iran could get a deal across the table. Israel, of course, blew this up and blew up any attempt at trying to reach an agreement peacefully. Now that they're at this point, Donald Trump seems to believe that there is still a possibility for a negotiation. Do you think Iran will come back to the negotiating table now?
Well, look, Iran was at the negotiating table. The Iranian foreign minister was supposed to meet his American counterpart, Steve Witkoff, the American envoy, on Sunday. And they made some major strides in the past 2 months. They were building trust between them. Of course, there were disagreement, but Trump, as you said, praised the talks and talked about the possibility, the likelihood of a breakthrough. 2 days before the diplomatic round of meeting, Benjamin Netanyahu attacked Iran, declared all-out war, in order to sabotage the nuclear talks between Iran and between the United States. And also, I think, in order to divert attention from the catastrophic war in Gaza, that is the starvation of the Palestinian people, 2.3 million people, and ultimately to bring about a regime change. So if I were sitting in Tehran today, and we know, and the Iranian leadership knows, that Benjamin Netanyahu could not have done what he did without either a green light from Donald Trump or at least turning a blind eye to what Israel did. So how do you rebuild trust? How could you trust Donald Trump? How could you go back to the negotiating table when the Iranian foreign minister was asked by his French and British counterpart to give diplomacy a chance? He said, look, we have always believed in diplomacy. We were sitting on the negotiating table, and Israel and the United States blew up the entire negotiating table. Just to give you another example, just a few days ago, Donald Trump said Iran has 2 weeks to think about a diplomatic path. I won't attack Iran for the next 2 weeks. Yet 24 hours later, Donald Trump gave the order to attack the 3 major Iranian nuclear facilities. So the question is not whether to go back to the negotiating table. How do you trust the word of the United States or the word of the president? A president who basically says something and does something else. So I don't know. I am the reason why I am not very hopeful about a diplomatic breakthrough, because if you read carefully, if you listen carefully, what the United States and what the French president and European diplomacy wants from Iran, they want unconditional surrender. Don't please use the word diplomacy. What Iran is asked to do is to basically forfeit its sovereignty. What do they want from Iran, for your own viewers? They want Iran to give up its nuclear program. No uranium enrichment on Iranian soil, which basically Iran has invested billions of dollars and years of sanctions in the past 3 decades in order to build a nuclear program. Secondly, they want Iran to give up its missile ballistic program. Not only the nuclear program, they also want Iran to give up its defensive capabilities. And finally, they want Iran to basically avoid supporting any of its regional allies in Yemen or Iraq or in Lebanon. So what really Iran is pressed between a rock, the rock of full surrender, or the hard place, you fight to the end. So the question on the table is not whether Iran will return to the negotiating table. The question is, will the United States and its European allies provide a negotiating position that allows Iran to begin the process of negotiations? Because they're asking Iran to forfeit its sovereignty, because they want Iran to be naked. So, final point on this. So what if Iran gives up everything? How can Iran ensure that Israel or the United States does not really come and do regime change after Iran becomes vulnerable and naked in the face of Israeli naked power and, strategic ambitions to bring about regime change in Tehran?
Because that also brings a point of whether Israel itself is going to respect, in the long or medium term, this kind of ceasefire, or are we going to see them treat the agreement the way that they've treated their ceasefire with Lebanon, for example, in which every couple of days or weeks they have at liberty to continue to conduct airstrikes. They have done the same in Syria, they've done the same in Iraq. What is going to really hold Israel back from continuing to treat Iran in the same way?
One of the lessons we have learned about Israel over the past several decades, Israel subscribed to a doctrine of absolute security, overwhelming force, freedom of action, and expansion. Israel's strategy could be defined in international relations, where I am here at the London School of Economics, is offensive realism. Offense is the best defense. Not only they violate the ceasefire in Lebanon on a daily basis, they violated the ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, openly, publicly, and everyone knows that Israel, after it exchanged some hostages with Hamas, violated the ceasefire and basically have now total siege of Gaza and violates international humanitarian law, uses food and medicine and fuel, weaponized humanitarian aid. No one should ever, if I were sitting in Tehran, and I'm not sitting in Tehran, how could I trust not only the Israelis, but also the Americans not to come and attack the Iranian leadership? What gives me hope, and this is a far-fetched hope, is that Donald Trump basically does not really want war to continue. He made it very clear today, and he used a 4-letter word, about what Israel did. And I have no doubts on my mind, in his telephone conversation with Netanyahu, he probably used other, 4-letter words. Mm-hmm. And we know that Joe Biden did the same thing throughout the war, Israel war on Gaza. So, yeah, Iran cannot trust Israel. And that's why Iran has to have a credible and effective deterrence. And here, let me go beyond your question, which is a very important question, and say, if I were sitting now, if I were Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader in Iran, or even the top advisors to Ali Khamenei, the existential question that faces Iran today after what Israel and the United States have done in the past 12 days, how could Iran basically develop a credible and effective deterrence? A credible and effective deterrence. We know that Iran's defensive strategy has failed. Iran is very cautious. Iran subscribed to a strategy of strategic patience, defensive as opposed to offensive. So my reading and many students of Iran, that all roads lead to a nuclear deterrence. All roads lead to a North Korean strategy that is weaponizing its nuclear program. But this is easier said than done.
And we heard just this morning from Iran's nuclear chief, Mohammad Islami. He said the country was prepared for damage to its facilities. It was prepared for these airstrikes from the US and is going to continue its nuclear program. So as it stands now, is this really the only path forward? And not just for Iran, for others in the region that could be studying what is happening to Iran and worrying about their own deterrence?
I mean, for Iran, it's a very risky option. First of all, we do not know the extent of damage to its nuclear facilities. Even if Iran has saved some of the, weapons, uranium enrichment stockpiles, you need equipments, you need factories, and this has been destroyed, and it will take many years. And any attempt to weaponize its nuclear program could trigger all-out American war, as President Trump has repeatedly said. So it's a highly risky strategy. But I think the bigger lesson of what Israel and the United States have done in the past 2 days is that other regional powers now are thinking of the same thing. How do we develop a credible and effective deterrence in the face of Israel's offensive strategy, in the face of Israel's technological superiority, in the face of Israel's superiority in arms, air force, intelligence? And already Turkey has made it very clear. It wants to speed up the development of ballistic missiles. Egypt probably thinking the same way. I would not be surprised now if Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Turkey begin thinking seriously about what we call a credible and effective deterrence. Because as President Erdogan has made it very clear, that Israel seems to be acting as an imperial power, as a mini imperial power. No checks and balances, no royal guards. It could do anything. And here Benjamin Netanyahu is boasting about the fact that he is changing the face of the Middle East. Benjamin Netanyahu wants to remake the Middle East in his own image. So you could imagine how the Turkish leaders, Egyptian leaders, and Saudi leaders, who do not say it in public, but privately, are thinking about the morning after. And in order to deter Israel, in order to really build very effective deterrence in the face of the overwhelming and massive armada that the United States and the West have provided Israel in the past few decades.
There's been a lot of talk about regime change from Israel, from Donald Trump, from many voices in the West over the last couple of days. And certainly there are many inside Iran who would love to see political change in their country. But under these conditions, with the war, with the destruction, with the hostility that Iran has been under, is this now, this concept of regime change, more or less likely to happen following this war?
I think it has always been. It has always been more of an illusion than reality. Regime change, the idea of regime change in Iran, has never been realistic. Why? Not because the Iranian regime is popular at home. We know there are millions of Iranians who look at the regime and see an oppressive regime, a regime that basically encroaching on people's lives. Young people in particular, men and women, would like a freer life. They would like to basically be able to bark, to breathe. And the oppressiveness of the clerical regime has made it very unpopular. We've seen hundreds of thousands of Iranians who have protested against the regime. But when you read what the question of regime change implies, you have local proxies. You don't have local proxies in Iran, as the United States had in Iraq, or as the West had in Libya. There are no local proxies outside. There is no alternative inside Iran. There is no external alternative. And the Iranian regime, despite its unpopularity, has a legitimate revolutionary base of support. That is, there are hundreds of thousands of people who would die, who would fight to the end to defend the regime. So despite the waning of the legitimacy of the clerics in Tehran, they have a certain revolutionary legitimacy. It's deeply entrenched. It's not a one-man show like you have in the Arab world. It's institutionalized. To give you an idea what I mean by that, when Israel and the United States threatened to kill the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, what did Ali Khamenei do? He transferred most of his powers to the National Security Council. In Iran, you have a National Security Council, collective decision-making process that decides on questions of war and peace. So it's not a one-man show, even though the supreme leader is the commander-in-chief in Iran. So there is neither a viable domestic alternative, and there is no viable alternative, to the regime itself. What Israel has been trying to do is to trigger civil strife, to try to trigger civil strife, that try to really get to Netanyahu has addressed the Iranian people multiple times. He wants them to rise up, stand up against the Iranian regime. One thing we know about Iranians, like everyone else, they are nationalistic, they are patriotic. When their country and sovereignty and nation is attacked, they rally around the flag. In fact, many Iranians are angry at the regime, not because it involved them in a war against Israel, but because the regime did not weaponize their nuclear program. Many Iranians say, look, you've spent billions. Look at the sweat and the hardship we have done. Why would you allow yourself to be vulnerable? Why would you allow Iran to be humiliated? Why would you allow yourself to be attacked by a small state like Israel? So in fact, what we have seen on the whole, and I could be wrong, of course, I'm outside now, is that we're seeing a bit of the rallying around the flag, as opposed to really standing up against the regime itself.
Finally, Professor, Iran is often portrayed in the West as this regional pariah state that is, for decades, a sponsor of terrorism in the region and single-handedly preventing stability in the Middle East. Do you think this is an accurate picture of what Iran is?
I think, and this is for your own viewers, the Western narrative, the dominant Western narrative, has succeeded in demonizing Iran. Wherever you go, I can tell you, I am a professor here at the London School of Economics. I get invited to many think tanks. It's so hard to find a Western politician or policymaker or analyst who does not think that Iran is a rogue state, who does not think that Iran represents a threat to regional stability and international stability. This is deeply ingrained because of the demonization against Iran since the 1980s, after the American hostages, after, Iranian student took American hostages after the Iranian Revolution in 1980. So it's really widespread. It's taken for granted now. Popular discussion, popular debate. Iran, the clerics are seen as the central source of instability. And my take on it, before I directly answer your question, Iranian leaders have been their own worst enemies. They have not really done much to try to change this dominant narrative. They have not really basically tried to appeal to, think tanks and Western public opinion. And also, I think what we need to understand is that Iran regional rivalries with its Arab neighbors have basically alienated public opinion in the region, in particular its rivalry with the Sunni-dominated state, Saudi Arabia. And I think what Iran did in Syria by intervening in Syria in 2011 to basically prevent the collapse of Bashar al-Assad really turned the world against Iran and reinforced the idea that Iran was a rogue state. But the reality, Iran has never aggressed against its neighbors. Iran has never declared wars against its neighbors. Iran's foreign policy has been extremely cautious, extremely defensive, extremely calculating, extremely rational, of course, with the exception of its intervention in Syria. So really, it's not Iran that's the central source of instability, it's Israel. What Israel has been doing to the Palestinians on the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and now in Gaza. What Israel had, this is really the source of instability. But of course, Iran has been portrayed as the source of instability because the dominant narrative has taken hold of, Western imagination.
Professor Fawaz Jurgis, we really appreciate your time and your analysis. Thank you so much for being here with us. That was Fawaz Jurgis, author of The Great Betrayal, The Struggle for Freedom and Democracy in the Middle East. So what is the state of Iran's nuclear program? Will it now abandon nuclear enrichment altogether, or will it be convinced that a nuclear weapon is the only way to protect itself in the future? Well, to tell us more, we're joined by MEE reporter Tamara Himani. Tamara, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us, there's been these airstrikes that the U.S. has taken on behalf of Israel over the weekend, destroying, at least on paper, 3 of Iran's key nuclear sites. What is left? Do we have an understanding of what exactly was destroyed and what survived?
Well, I should caution that obviously what we've seen of the damage so far are satellite images of the facilities themselves. And obviously the bulk of these facilities are deeply, deeply underground. So the true extent of the damage is yet to be seen. It's too early for intelligence to tell. President Trump said that they were totally obliterated, but senior US and Israeli officials have been far more cautious in describing the damage done. They say that there has been heavily extensive damage, that Iran's nuclear program is likely significantly set back. They've talked in a time frame of years, but again, can't be more specific than that. And they're fairly confident that they've been able to impose crippling damage. You've had the former UN weapons inspector saying that it seems like it's damaged their centrifuges program, which is basically what Iran uses to enrich its uranium. That comes with an obvious caveat, which is that U.S. officials have admitted that they are unable to account for about 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. So by highly enriched, we're talking at about 60%, and that's basically a stone's throw from the 90%, which would be weapons level. So that's quite serious. What they assume happened is that Iran, kind of like anticipating these strikes, moved that uranium out of its facilities beforehand and moved it to a secure location. There were evidence that there were trucks outside these facilities ready to transport it. So if it does have that uranium elsewhere, it may also have centrifuges elsewhere with which to enrich it. And that uranium, just to put it into context, 400 kilograms is about enough for estimated 9 or 10 atomic bombs. So obviously, how soon Iran would be able to enrich that uranium is obviously a more ambiguous matter. But the fact that it does have that elsewhere shows that, its nuclear capacity, despite whatever Trump may say in his typically understated fashion, is not completely off the table. And it wouldn't surprise me if that were the case, because we know that, Iran has been anticipating this kind of U.S. attack.
So this is what we think they are able to do, or what has survived from their nuclear program. The other big question, of course, is what they intend to do, because this war kicked off because of two primary reasons. Israel's desire to derail nuclear peace talks between the US and Iran, and Donald Trump himself, his frustration with the way the peace talks were going. From my understanding, there was 6 weeks of talks that were going well and were progressing until the US sort of introduced this new requirement of Iran, which is this idea of zero enrichment. So what does zero enrichment actually mean for Iran, and how likely is it that Iran now, after everything that's happened, goes back to the table and accepts those terms?
Yeah, so I mean, even when you look back to the negotiations during the JCPOA, the zero enrichment was always the major sticking point. With the JCPOA, they obviously agreed on 3.67%, which
this is the Obama-led
the Obama nuclear deal,
which was signed in 2015. That Donald Trump then tore up in 2018.
Exactly. And so the enrichment agreed was 3.67%, which is the amount needed for civil nuclear capacity, right? And Iran has always said it wants the right to enrich uranium, that it doesn't want zero enrichment. Now, there were talks during the negotiations led by Trump most recently that actually, in one proposal supposedly sent by his envoy, Steve Witkoff, that they were open to that level of enrichment. But then you obviously have a lot of hawks, a lot of hardliners who are saying we actually want zero enrichment. You get a letter signed by over 200 congressional Republicans, including nearly all Republican senators, saying zero enrichment. You obviously have the influence of Netanyahu, AIPAC, other pro-Israel groups really pushing for that zero enrichment stance. And I think that's when Trump's stance starts to change during the negotiations, and that's when negotiations fall apart. And obviously now he's sticking on that zero enrichment. That leaves Iran in a particularly unacceptable position, because if you are Iran, obviously, given the losses of the past year, you've lost basically all your allied militias in the region. Hezbollah, Iran's best deterrent, no longer serves that value against Israel. You've lost most of your air defenses in Israeli attacks. Your military chain of command, much of your military leadership has been wiped out. So if you're Iran, the pragmatists, those in favor of negotiating with the US, taking a softer stance, they are on the back foot right now. Those who have the, can press the political advantage in Iran and in Iranian decision-making are the more hawkish militarist factions who are understandably feeling extremely paranoid, extremely distrustful. They had the JCPOA, and then Trump tore that up. They had ongoing nuclear talks in June, and then Trump abandoned that in what is widely being discussed as kind of a joint U.S.-Israeli deception campaign. You know what I mean? So what would be your rationale to believe that if you entered a nuclear deal now, that the U.S. would be any more credible than when it was a few years ago? And Iran only really needs to look to historical precedent to make that decision. In 2003. After the invasion of Iraq, Libya gives up the bomb in exchange for, the survival of its leadership. The U.S. says basically, we'll leave your government in place, we'll lift sanctions, we'll welcome you back into the international community, and in return, you get rid of your weapons of mass destruction program. Gaddafi says, okay. Come a few years later, 2011, and the U.S. is helping rebels overthrow Gaddafi in an air campaign on his government. So Iran will look at that and compare it with, say, North Korea. Again, a much smaller, conventionally weaker, both economically and militarily, power, a long-time U.S. opponent, but quietly developed a nuclear program, which, makes the U.S. very reluctant to enter direct conflict with it, So from Iran, when it is feeling its most weak, when the U.S. and Israel are not only not making credible guarantees of regime change, but of regime protection, but openly suggesting overthrowing Iran's government, Iran may feel that having at least an ambiguous position on nuclear enrichment, even if not a weapon, just a bit of room for maneuver, is pretty much its only source of leverage to ensure the survival of its leadership, which has faced, its biggest threat over the past year and a half than it has since it first came to power and was immediately invaded by Iraq.
Really, really fascinating. Thank you for bringing that historical perspective into it. And when we look at those examples, perhaps it gives us an insight into what Iranian leadership is thinking now and in the coming days. There is a ceasefire. Of course, it's not going to be that simple, and we'll keep an eye on the situation as it evolves. Tamara, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks very much for having me.